This is part 4. They will go over the history anyway, so if you missed part 1, 2, and 3, don't worry. We are going to have a lecture tonight. We have a lecture next week, and then we have a lecture in November that is on Zoom, so feel free to join us. I'm going to introduce briefly the characters involved tonight. This is David Nicholas. He is one of our board members, and he's done a lot of research on the planes, trains, crashes, and other things that happen in town, so he's going to be here tonight. Steve Leatham is also here. He is going to also participate tonight. Stu is also here. He's helping us with video and technology tonight. Thank you, Stu. I appreciate it. And Rory Murphy is also here tonight, and he's going to talk a little bit about his experiences. So thank you all for coming, and enjoy.
Thank you, Diane.
Okay.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. I'm not too loud, too obnoxious? No. Great. Anyway, good evening. Thank you very much for being here. Before we begin, some introductions, a little more detail than Diane gave. Steve Leatham and I have been working on this project for over 7 years now. It's amazing he's had the patience to put up with me that long, so thank you, Steve, very much. Also tonight we have Rory Murphy. My term of affection for him, or endearment, is the Pope of Park City. For those of you who don't know Rory, he's a longtime Park City gentleman, one of our premier builders, and very generous in the community in his give-backs to the community. Rory joined us in our lectures about 2 in, and in the past, they were always missing something, because none of us could talk about jumping out of an airplane, and I have no intentions of being able to talk about it myself, and let alone jumping out of a plane on a dark and stormy night. Rory, in his military career, was a member of the famed 82nd Airborne, and his military career ended on a dark and stormy night as a result of bad orders. I don't know what the right term is, but orders that should not have been issued. So Rory's here to add a perspective in context to the airmen who bailed out of our plane. We also have Stuart Stanek joining us tonight. He and I have been researching what the U.S. political climate was 1935 to 1941. There's 2 parts to the talk tonight, my part and Steve's. You'll see, we titled our lecture Iron Mountain Miracle. This is version 4.0. What does that mean? Unlike 3G, 4G, 5G, which I cannot tell you about, version 4.0 will be some new material that we've never covered before. Previous editions, 1.0, which was 6 years ago, was 1.5 hours. So people loved it, standing room only at the museum, but in order to kind of thin things down or skinny it down, version 2.0 was 1 hour long, and that was really our main road show. We did tour throughout the state giving lectures on this plane crash to sell out crowds. Version 3.0, which we did last year, discussed the connection between Pearl Harbor, Park City, and our plane crash. And tonight's lecture will discuss the connection between Park City, our plane crash, and one of the most daring rescues in World War II. So we hope that you'll enjoy that. Okay, acknowledgements, of course, are in order. To everyone in the audience, thank you for being here tonight. We're honored. We'd like to thank the Park City Museum and Diane Kinspel for inviting us to lecture tonight. Steve and I would also like to acknowledge an ecosystem we call the Village. Over the last 7 years, we've had help from a lot of different people. Our village now exceeds 200 people from 10 different states that have contributed in one way or the other to our body of knowledge. So it wouldn't be right if we didn't talk about the contributions of this village. We also like to offer the caveat that our work we consider to be in progress, a work in progress. Tonight's lecture, especially Steve's part, is a perfect example of that. In the version 3.0 last year, a gentleman in the audience, which I very much regret I did not get his name, came up to us after our lecture and asked us, were we aware of the connection between a Park City resident and Elward Offred, and a rescue that occurred soon after our plane crash. We were not, and that forms the basis of Steve's part in the lecture tonight, the connection between our plane crash, Park City, and this daring rescue in World War II. I mentioned Steve, Rory, and Stu and myself. There's also a person that we have a special acknowledgement for, and I'm actually going to let Steve talk about that, and this is this gentleman, Frank Smith. Steve, please.
Well, those of you that have been with us before may remember Frank being here, especially those that were in the first lecture that we did up at the museum in the upstairs there. Frank Smith, his father, C.A. Smith, was on board the plane that evening, and in doing our research, we researched and got in touch with family members across the country and began to tell them and talk to them about the B-18 that crashed on Iron Mountain in Park City. And Frank was one of the first fellows that we got in touch with. And like all World War II greatest generation men, Frank's dad, C.A. Smith, had never mentioned this plane crash in Park City and surviving that and bailing out of the plane. And so we began to put the story together for Frank, and he became a very, very good supporter and a person that really brought other families into the fold. One of the things I did was begin to send emails. What? Airmail was probably better. Anyway, I sent emails out to kind of feelers to family members that were out there. And one of the families that I got in touch with wrote back and thought that I was a scammer, thought that I was actually trying to solicit money from them in a scam. And so we called upon Frank to kind of vouch for us. And Frank was always a great supporter and wrote emails and talked with other family members after he had been here and seen our lecture and we presented information to him. He really began to bring those families in. And David and I had planned a trip to go up and see him this fall, and found out that he had esophageal cancer.
Yes.
Wasn't it, David? And passed away in a very, very short time. And so we remember Frank. He was the president of his Vietnam veteran unit up there in Idaho Falls, Idaho, and very involved in the service, of Vietnam survivor. And I think David told me that maybe part of the cause of his cancer was his bout with Agent Orange during the Vietnam War. So we're sad that he's not here, but we'll always remember his contributions. So
Yeah, thank you, Steve. And Frank, rest in peace, and thank you for everything you did for us. Before I move on, for those who might be interested in attending a version 1.0 refresh lecture, we have one, complete with the crowd, the band, on Tuesday, November 7th at the Park City Library. And that evening we'll pay particular attention to honoring veterans, as it is Veterans Day week. So I just want to mention that before I forget it. Okay, well, I'm going to give you a quick recap in case people were not in the previous lectures. We refer to this as our plane, okay? The reality is it's not ours. It belonged to the U.S. Army. So, but we can't help but affectionately calling it our plane. It's been nicknamed Christine. Steve will explain why, but yes, if you're thinking about the Stephen King book and movie by the same thing, that's how it got its name. What you see here is identical to the aircraft that crashed into Iron Mountain. There were three generations of B-18s. This is a Model A, the first generation. And I've developed an affection for this plane. It was ridiculed its whole life. It was bullied. Nobody liked it. Bad press wherever you went. And I couldn't understand, why, when the U.S. Army issued an RFP in 1935 for a next generation bomber, they would select something which Ralph Nader would refer to, if he was alive at the time, as unsafe at any airspeed, okay? And there were three companies that replied to that RFP: the G.L. Martin Corporation, Boeing Corporation, and Douglas Aircraft. The product entrants from the G.L. Martin Corporation and Boeing were spectacular. They were truly next generation. I will be kind in what I'm about to say about Douglas Aircraft, but their submission was inferior. Okay. And how did that come to be? Well, there are a variety of reasons, both political, international, economic. First of all, you have the Great Depression, which laid waste to our country's economy. You also had a political climate that was very isolationist, and that belief that our oceans would keep us safe from any harm, and that there was no reason to invest in our military. And Douglas Aircraft had a very particular problem. Their product planners had overestimated the demand for their first generation commercial airliner, a DC-2. And the DC-3, which is a replacement to it and would go on to be a hit product, was soon to be introduced. So if anybody in the audience has ever dealt with an inventory problem, you know that it doesn't fix itself, and it only gets worse as time goes on. So Douglas Aircraft was desperate to get rid of this inventory. So when they replied to the RFP, their strategy was, we're going to reconfigure the DC-2 into a peacetime bomber. Why worry about war? And we're going to offer a price to the Army so low, almost free. Take it as is. We're going to build as many as we have parts for, 351. And oh, by the way, after we build that, we're building no more, and forget about spare parts. The inability to have spare parts soon after the plane came off the production line led to a procedure of cannibalizing other B-18s to keep others in air or flying. And our plane that crashed here was partially a victim of having some of its key flight subsystems taken from it to use in other aircraft. So it was basically unairworthy. Another example of this plane being unairworthy, by the time of our crash on November 17, 1941, half of all 351 planes were permanently out of service. Within the Air Corps ranks, it could be considered a widowmaker, especially if it was flying at night and a stormy night. So nobody liked the plane, and crudely speaking, it was a piece of shit. So I'm sorry for that bad language. And you know what? Nobody really cared, because we weren't going to go to war with our isolationist policies and protected by our oceans. So what was the U.S. political climate? Oh, I want to say before I continue, I'm not talking today. If anybody wants to draw parallels between 1935 to 1941 and today, that is your own business. But I and Stu are strictly talking about 1935 to 1941. We don't want our cars blown up or anything like that. Also, in case people want to detect a certain political bent, I'm a registered independent, and I have been for years. I have no affiliation to either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. So I just want to state that for the record, please. Okay, now that I got that little qualifier over with, our country at the time was suffering from partisan politics. Religious and racial tensions were awful. There was an erosion of democratic principles, and there was extreme divisiveness throughout the country. How did that come to happen? I was trying to figure it out, talking to Stu about it, and so we were doing some research. You dig down a little bit, and lo and behold, there was a plot against America. A well-coordinated, well-defined, pervasive program run by the Third Reich that commenced in 1935. It was headed by Hermann Göring, arguably the second most powerful gentleman after Hitler in the Third Reich. What was the goal of this program? It was to ensure US neutrality, let Germany conquer Europe, including the United Kingdom, and hey, leave us alone. And promote Nazism and all the benefits associated with Nazism. Unbelievable. How are they going to do this? This was their program. It would include charm. It would include guile. It would include sex, bribery, extortion, investment, propaganda, and espionage. Over the course of 6 years, there were up to 200 German agents operating in the United States in pursuit of fulfilling the goal of promoting and maintaining US neutrality and promoting Nazism. What were the target verticals? They're listed there. Vertical is my term. I don't know if it's an appropriate term. But there was no aspect of our country that wasn't touched by this effort by Germany. Next. There's no reason for me to list all the names. I'll talk about, by the way, the Congress of Industrial Organizations separately. But this is just a list of a few corporations that turned a blind eye to what was happening in Germany and what was happening in Europe. Why did they do that? Greed, I have to say. At the time, in 1937, the combined investment by these companies in the Third Reich was $600 million. In today's dollars, it would be $13 billion. They knew well what would happen if they piped up about anything going on in Germany. It had been made very clear to them. And certainly beginning as early as 1933, there was no doubt that examples would be made of people and or corporations if they dare spoke up against the Fuhrer. So either directly or indirectly, they turned a blind eye. In some cases, they were ardent supporters of the principles of Nazism. And they were certainly ardent supporters of the concept of isolationism, which was to keep us out of foreign entanglements. The two gentlemen, the photographs we have here, are the only two US gentlemen to receive the highest civilian honor from the Third Reich. And it's a mouthful, so I got to look at it. It's the Service Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. And in the top photo, we have Henry Ford receiving that award. And in the bottom photo, we have Charles Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy, one of the most recognized personalities of the 1930s, receiving the award at a banquet in his honor in Berlin, given to him by none other than Hermann Göring himself. And that award was reserved for those who promoted the benefits of Nazism, and certainly Henry Ford and Charles Lindbergh did that. Wait, go back one more. Sorry. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, one of the largest labor unions in the country at the time, was headed by a gentleman by John L. Lewis. He had aspirations to run against Roosevelt in the 1940 presidential election. And he wanted to ensure that he had the support of a group of what today we would call political action committees, which I will talk about, and also access to money from the German government. As far as the German government was concerned, money was no object to influence activities in the United States. In the 1940 presidential campaign, there were $10 million in cash at the German embassy in Washington, D.C., to be used to invest in the campaigns of those politicians, whether Democrat or Republican, that promoted isolationism. Next. Academia or universities were also involved in these activities. While there were many of them, I list just for the more notables. We have Yale University, we have Columbia, Stanford, and Mount Holyoke. Yale in particular was the birthplace of America First, which became the largest pro-Nazi, pro-isolation organization in the country. At its peak, 850,000 members called themselves members of that. I asked a friend of mine, I've never been to Yale, but I asked a friend of mine who did matriculate there, is there a plaque on the Yale campus commemorating the birthplace of America First? They said no. So anyway, the universities were also involved, and targets, and were willing accomplices, because again, money's no object. The German government is giving them money to encourage exchange programs, get people over to Germany for an extended period of time, have them attend all the brainwashing ceremonies that went on over there. Next. The media, and I'm going to let Stu chime in here when you're ready to, but the media was a very favorite target for this plot against America. The two largest radio networks at the time were CBS and NBC, and also newspapers and print. How did this happen? It happened with buying ad time, paying to have extreme people speak on there about the benefits of Nazism and the benefits of isolationism, and running a campaign of disinformation against Roosevelt and against the British and against the New Deal. The Germans did not want Roosevelt to win the 1940 presidential election. Stu, you want to add anything?
Well, the shares of audience that the radio networks were generating back then were astronomical. If you look at the biggest TV show in America right now, it reaches 4.9% of the audience. The second, and that's Thursday night or Sunday Night Football. The next one is 1%, so about 3.2 million viewers. There's a radio show that Dave will talk about, Father Coughlin, who reached 30 million people a week, which is 25% of every person of the entire population of America. So the impact of this, it's roughly 10 or 20 times the size of the share of the biggest TV show in America right now. I'm kind of stunned.
Okay, next. Political, of course, you know, you're going to take your money there. It's estimated that there were 24 U.S. senators and congressmen who received money from the German government to promote Nazism and pro-isolationist policies. Again, it was on both sides of the aisle. In particular, there were two that were quite notable, and I'm going to have Stu weigh in. Senator Ernest Lundeen from Minnesota. The parentheses, George Sylvester Varick was considered Hitler's #1 agent in the United States. He was born in Germany. He immigrated to the United States in the early 1920s. And he was an ardent, Nazi, what can I say, and ingrained himself with Senator Lundeen. Senator Lundeen accepted millions of dollars in bribes from George Varick to promote isolationism and the benefits of Nazism. Another member, congressman from New York, Hamilton Fish III, also was very involved in these activities. And between Lundeen and Hamilton Fish, they set up a process that became known as the franking scandal. If people in the audience are not aware of the term franking, it actually originates from the origination of the British Parliament. And it's a process by which official correspondence from members of Parliament and or members of Congress can be sent out with no charge, free. You know, you don't have to pay for postage. And when somebody receives this, it has a very official looking envelope and header, so you're kind of inclined to say, oh, what am I getting this for? And over the course of 5 years, this propaganda operation was run out of Senator Lundeen's Senate office. They sent millions and millions of pieces of literature spreading hate, discontent, and disinformation. And eventually, they got caught. Again, Stu, in a second, Senator Lundeen met an untimely end that you will soon hear about, and under mysterious circumstances. And Hamilton Fish was chased from office and was not reelected, and never again served in the U.S. House of Congress. And you want to add a little color to our good senator?
Here's the color commentary. Lundeen was sitting in his office, going to go to the airport. He was crying, weeping openly, and his secretary couldn't get out, find out what's wrong. He said, I think I've gone too far. He goes to the airport, he's crying all the way to the airport, the plane takes off. It's a DC-3, which is a lot better than the B-18. Eyewitnesses saw it normal takeoff, and it just augured into the ground with both engines at full blast. There was 2 FBI agents and a U.S. attorney on the plane. At the time of the crash, the investigators determined the pilot and the co-pilot were not in control of the plane. Lindeen was on there, he was crying on there, FBI was there, the Justice Department was there, and it was the biggest air tragedy in America at the time, and they never figured out what happened. But the engines, it hit the ground so hard, the engines were buried 6 feet underground. That's how hard it hit the ground. So it was an ugly time, and eyewitnesses said they've never seen anything like it at the time, so not a good ending to it.
Thank you so much, Steph. Yeah, so a lot of funny stuff going on. Bad stuff, of course. Oh, the PACs. This is a modern term. I have not found a term that refers to these type of organizations from that period of time. We're talking 35 to 41. Please don't stone me. Anyway, these were the primary PACs that were invested in and promoted isolationism and Nazism. You can read them yourself. The combined membership approached 2 million people. They were pro-Nazi, pro-isolation, and what else did they have in common? A very horrible term to say. They were all white supremacists. All white supremacists, and members from both parties belonged to them. And Father Charles Coughlin, he was head of the Christian Front. As Stu mentioned, his power on the radio was unmatched. And with 20 to 30 million people listening into him, he used it to raise money. He hired legions of people to accept the money that was being sent to him. He was nothing but a race-baiting bigot, and I can't be any more blunt than that. And they called him the radio preacher. He should have been called the preacher of hate. But ultimately, he ran afoul of the Pope. And no matter how powerful he thought he was, no matter how much money he had, ultimately the church would step on him. Of course, we close out with the KKK. You know, they were all part of that group of despicable people. Next. How effective were they? Don't know. We'll never really know. But tying it back to the plane. Here we have this poor little plane that didn't really stand a chance. It's like an ugly duckling. And it was born in this cauldron of economic and political stress, and you get what you pay for, right? The Neutrality Acts, there were 4 of them. You can see when they were passed. Each one was more restrictive than the one before, and their sole intent was to make sure that we provided no comfort of any kind to any of our allies that were at war. And that included those in Europe and those in the Pacific. Again, a belief we don't need to worry about the rest of the world. Our oceans will protect us. America first, we don't need anybody. Now these photographs I find just simply stunning. On first glance, when I was looking at them, Stu and I were looking at them, we were equally aghast. And you would think they're taking place in Germany. These 2 photographs are on Long Island at a Nazi rally. And there's I can't add any more details. Your eyes can see for yourself what is going on.
What year was it?
Those photographs are 1938. All right, here we have the late 30s. I don't know the specific dates on this. But the top photograph is a pro-German, pro-isolation rally and parade in New York City, advocating that the United States and Nazi Germany can collaborate and coexist, and everything's wonderful. The next photograph down there is from White Plains, New York, at a Nazi rally at a Legion Hall. And look at that audience. Quite chilling to me, I'm sorry. And we're going to close out this series of disturbing photographs with one of the most disturbing. February 1939, we have America First holding a rally at Madison Square Garden. They would hold many rallies at Madison Square Garden, the last one being in August of 1941. Okay, keynote speaker, Charles Lindbergh. And there's capacity of the garden at the time, 20,000. There's 20,000 people jammed in there. They estimate another 100,000 listening to Lindbergh's broadcast on loudspeakers, and then another 4 million people listening to the broadcast on the radio airways carried by NBC, and again, ultimately paid for with contributions from the German government. So I will say one thing about Lindbergh. He did try to rehabilitate his image after Pearl Harbor, and he applied for a commission, and it was denied by Roosevelt. Roosevelt had was long tired, of the endless criticism of Roosevelt and the New Deal by America First and by Lindbergh personally. And Lindbergh was denied a commission, although he did go on to serve in the Pacific in a logistic and advisory role. But his reputation never recovered from his association with America First, and he was their primary spokesman. Okay, well, don't worry, our oceans are going to protect us. Don't have to invest in our military. Don't need to worry about what's going on in the rest of the world. Well, that served you well. And I might add, there are those who would argue that in the case of Japan, they sensed the weakness. They were well aware of that in the United States. And for those of you who either saw the movie, the most recent one, Midway, which I think is terrific, or read the book At Dawn We Slept, I would say it wasn't at dawn we slept. We've been sleeping for almost a decade. But Admiral Yamamoto knew that Japan could not win a long war with the United States, a short war. And he felt that they could take advantage of the political divisiveness in our country with a knockout blow, and that we would not have the resolve to band together to deal with them and to deal with Germany. And fortunately, as we all know the outcome of that story, but this is a great country. And on more than one occasion, this country has saved the rest of the world from calamity. And was the German program effective? One could argue either way, but certainly it didn't hurt what they wanted to accomplish. And Pearl Harbor, once and for all, ended the debate or the discussion that our oceans will keep us safe. So with that, we're going to have a switch of computers here, and I will say, I hope you liked what I had to say, but whether you liked it or not, what you're about to hear, you're really going to like. Do I turn my mic off? We will be done by 6, Diane, don't worry, 6 or so. And Q&A, questions, complaints, suggestions, please talk to us after the lecture. We're in no rush to go anywhere.
It'll take just a minute for the computer to switch over, I hope.
There you go, Steve.
I was telling Marge there before the lecture began, I'd much rather be back in my old classroom with an overhead projector. It's something that I'd made and could lay on there and project up there for you. So this worked once, so we'll see if it.
Should I unplug it and replug it back in, Steve?
I'll just let it go
Okay.
just a little bit further.
It's doing something. Phone home.
Steve, your slide changed over here on the computer.
I changed that. I don't know, maybe try plugging it in again, Mr. Steve.
Any gear grinding problems, I'll take responsibility.
David, was Lindbergh on the payroll, the German payroll?
You know, there's no direct evidence he took cash from them, but he did travel extensively. After his son was killed, they moved to United Kingdom to escape the publicity, and also spent time living in France. And he became very enthralled with them, as you know, and was an ardent supporter of everything associated with the Third Reich, including stating publicly that we could not win a war with them.
Okay, that was pretty academic, so now we'll get back to my simple life here in Park City. I kind of put up that saying, old soldiers never die, they just fade away. I'll be talking a little bit about General MacArthur here in just a few minutes, and that was part of his address, his final farewell address to Congress, after he'd been relieved of command in April of 1951. And it kind of reminds me of my purpose always for being here is to always remember the sacrifices and the contributions of those men and women who served our country. And so that's really what this lecture, at least my part of the lecture, is about, is remembering some of those human stories that were part of this B-18 crash lecture that we have. David mentioned this is the fourth in a series, and those of you that really want to hear the details of the first lecture, we'll be doing that on November 7th at the Park City Library at 4 o'clock. And so come prepared, it takes about 90 minutes. And we'll be doing that again on kind of a remembrance of Veterans Day on November 7th, just before Veterans Day. I mentioned Frank and Frank being there. Frank was never one for the spotlight. He always kind of stayed behind the scenes, but did a lot for us. Part of this lecture is what I call Iron Mountain Courage, and it's what we call the final flight of our B-18, which was Bolo 36311. It's one of the first ones that were made. It was in the first generation of B-18s. And we're going to talk about, I'm just going to give a quick overview. There's always the meat and potatoes of this lecture, and that's what I'm going to give, just a quick overview of that on the evening of November 16th and 17th, 1941, what happened here in Park City. One of the things that we were able to do was raise funds to remember the 7 men that were on board the aircraft that evening. And we were able to erect a plaque over here at
Squatters.
We call it Squatters. I don't know what it's called now, the Roadhouse Cafe or whatever. But we always felt a kinship with those 7 men and wanted to remember them and what they went through and how much courage they showed on that evening. And I'm sure that they were very, very scared of what they had to do. And it took great courage for them to bail out of that plane on that evening. Another picture of Christine in flight, and I'll just give a quick overview of why we call her Christine. It really does get back to Stephen King's, I think it was what, a 1956 or a 58 Plymouth? And Christine had the power to regenerate herself. If she was in a wreck, or there were groups of teenagers that beat the crap out of her, and anyway, Christine always was able to regenerate herself, and she had this supernatural power, and she had always in mind revenge. And so we'll talk just a little bit about that revenge. I always have Christine at the lectures with us, just for good luck. And I'll talk just a little bit during the lecture about finding Christine. And we found that on the Memorial Day weekend in 2017. We took a hike up Iron Mountain, and I'll show you where we found Christine.
Lift it up so people can see it.
Oh yeah, I'll kind of pass it around if you want to look at it. This was a piece of Christine that we found, and I'll relate that story as we go on. Okay. These were the 7 men that were on board the aircraft that evening, and you can see there that they were from all different parts of our country. You can see their ages. The oldest on the flight was the commander of the 88th Reconnaissance Squadron, Robert E. Pirtle, and the youngest was a young man from Ogden, Utah, Jack Anderson. And those 2 fellows were killed in the accident that evening. You can see that they came from all across the country. You can see their titles and what positions they held: pilot, co-pilot. C.A. Smith, Frank Smith's father, was a passenger on the plane that evening, and as was Eugene Bynum. And we'll talk just a little bit more about each of those as we go along. This is where they were sitting on the plane that evening. You can see that the pilot and the co-pilot, and it was actually supposed to be a pretty easy flight back from Lowry Field in Denver. And they took off from Denver about 9 o'clock in the evening. We were supposed to make a nice easy flight back to Salt Lake City, be back in Salt Lake in about 3 hours. And so you can see where they were on that plane. A couple of things always baffle us about this thing. When we got the accident report, the pilot, Lieutenant Basie, bailed out of the plane and supposedly went through a hatch just above the pilot's seat there. David has visited the B-18 and crawled through there, and
Wait, you can't.
we were told that there was no way that a guy with a parachute on could get through that hatch. That's always been a mystery for us. The other 6 went through the door on the back right-hand side there. And that door is very, very narrow, probably 2 feet or maybe 30 inches wide. And so for these men to get back there and get out through that door itself was well, we call it a miracle. So just a couple of new bits of information there for you. Now, these men were flying. They'd been over to Lowry Field, as I said, in Denver, and they were flying back to Salt Lake City. And war was pretty much inevitable at that time. And they were part of what President Roosevelt had called a secret operation called Operation Plum. And the idea was that, the thought was that the first attack by the Japanese would be on the Philippine Islands, not on Pearl Harbor. And so the president had taken some steps. He'd appointed General MacArthur to be the commander in the Far East and stationed him in the Philippines there. And he had given these secret orders to begin shuttling brand new B-17 bombers from the manufacturing here in the United States through Hawaii and then on to the Philippine Islands for the defense of the Philippines. This was a secret operation, and these men were part of that. And they had been to Denver to say goodbye to their families and make last-minute arrangements there. And then they were to be the pilots and the crews that flew those planes through Hawaii to the Philippines. In our last lecture, version 3, we talked about getting those B-17s from Hamilton Field in California to Hawaii. And if you remember correctly, a flight of 12 B-17s piloted by some of the men that we're talking about, flew into Pearl Harbor at the same time, exact same time that the Japanese were bombing Pearl Harbor. And I mean, we told that story last time, so I won't go through that again, but it was a very harrowing experience. All right, here's the meat and potatoes. We'll pick up the plane. It's over Fort Bridger, Wyoming, about 11:20 in the evening on the 16th. The pilot checks with Salt Lake City. The weather is high, thin clouds, and everything looks good. Estimated time of arrival, just a little after midnight. Visual flight conditions, they were able to spot on the ground landmarks, cities, lights of cities, and things like that. So they're on their way and heading towards Salt Lake City. Everything looks pretty smooth. They're on this heading about 232 degrees, 12,000 feet. And they come in over Night, Wyoming, then down over Colville and on into Salt Lake City. There is a little storm that's blowing in from the north, and by this time it has Colville kind of socked in. It has a solid overcast about 6,000 feet, and that was one of their reference points in the visual flight, was Colville. It couldn't be seen, and there was a light rain beginning to fall. You can see the storm front there that was moving in from the northwest and coming into the area, and Colville being clouded in. Now, along with this storm front, there were associated very, very strong winds, gale force winds, 35 to 50 miles an hour, blowing into the storm front there from the south. About 11:35, the plane passed over Night, Wyoming, but there was some confusion in the cockpit. The pilot thought he was over Colville, which was another, 32 miles farther along the flight path there. The co-pilot thought that the plane was over Night, Wyoming, and so there was some confusion there. Now that little distance, that little 32 miles made a difference. The pilot kept flying on, and as he flew on, he flew that extra 30 miles. Remember, he thought he was over Colville. He flew on the extra 32 miles and thought he should be over Salt Lake City. And at the time, they were confused. They were lost, couldn't spot Salt Lake City. So the pilot knew that this storm front now was getting stronger and was coming in. So Lieutenant Basie had an alternate plan to fly to Delta to avoid this storm. So he took the plane up to 14,000 feet and changed the heading of the plane to the south and started on this southerly course, a 160-degree course that brought him directly over Park City. This is about midnight. This is the beginning of November 17th. Now, as the plane came in over Park City, it made the change. We estimated somewhere out there over East Canyon State Park. It made the turn. Instead of heading on toward Salt Lake City, it headed on this 160-degree turn toward Park City, climbing to 14,000 feet. And about 4 minutes later, the plane comes in over Park City, comes in over here on the west side, probably over somewhere we figured maybe over Rotary Park area, and begins to fly up the west side of the mountain there. Now, as it's doing that, this strong wind, it begins to sleet and hail and snow and a mixture of all of that. And as the plane's coming in, these strong winds are buffeting the plane. It's rolling, it's up and down. It's like a roller coaster. And the plane seems to be losing airspeed. And so the order to abandon ship is given, and the airmen begin their preparations to bail out. And this is where we get our firsthand knowledge of what that was like to bail out of that airplane under those terrible conditions. And we asked Rory to come up and explain that to us.
Just speak into it, or? Okay. Hi, my name is Rory Murphy. I was an infantry paratrooper with the 82nd Airborne Division, as David mentioned. I had a very similar experience to what these guys went through. And what the story I'm going to tell you is, it's beyond rational understanding, okay? It's supernatural, all right? And am I doing this right? I think I'm going to talk. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. No, you can't? Okay.
Speak up.
All right, I'll use this, and if I don't do it right, I apologize. So, this truly was a supernatural experience. This was something that I cannot comprehend, and it's truly the hand of God. Okay. When I was a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne, December 2nd, 1986, I've been a paratrooper 4 years. We had a command mistake, as David has mentioned. They dropped us off at night in a storm with winds going 35 to 50 miles an hour. I think I'm getting some feedback. I'll come over here. The result of that was just about everyone in the stick was seriously injured. I broke my back and broke my hip, and it ended my military career. My family has been military for generations. My dad was career, my brother was career. We had 14 blue stars in our family and 2 gold stars. And if you don't know what that means, we had 14 people at war, and 2 of them died in my direct lineage. These men had never jumped before. I was part of a unit that is the best trained, the best equipped, the best supplied airborne unit in the entire world. Okay, and this is what happened to us. And I wasn't even the worst injured on this jump. This plane, these guys are in this plane. None of them had jumped before. Not one of them. Okay, and so they're in this plane. This thing is getting buffeted all over the place. And I want you to imagine this. And they're terrified. They don't know where they are. There's no landmarks. And suddenly the pilot says, fellas, we're bailing out. Here, put on a parachute. These guys had never put on a parachute before. And they started bailing out of this plane into 35, 50 mile an hour winds, pouring rain, 0 visibility in heaven knows where. Okay. Where they bailed out was, if you guys know where the Silver King mine is, they believe it was roughly over the Silver King mine. Now, the winds were coming from the south, as Steve mentioned, and they all come out. Of course, they're up high and they're drifting down. They're drifting to the north. Okay, here's where I can't reconcile this. Maybe you can. That plane does a 360-degree turn. The only person in that plane is Anderson. And my belief is, because everyone else bailed out, is he must have been injured or knocked unconscious, because there was a parachute in the plane. So he was in the plane, but he was in no position to do anything. Okay, this plane goes 360 degrees, you know, covering the course. That's about a 3-mile arc circle right there. Okay, these paratroopers, meantime, drifting right this way. Okay? Starting way up here, wind's bringing them, they're drifting down. That plane circled all the way around and went through those paratroopers. You think of the odds of that. Hurtle Pirtle was killed by the plane. 3 miles, probably 14,000 feet of elevation. Statistically impossible, okay? Pirtle, incidentally, was the one that gave the bailout order. That's why they like to call this plane Christine, right? They have, the whole idea is this plane decided, yeah, right, you're gonna leave me, I'm gonna, take you with me. I don't know, I mean, that's, of course, pure fantasy, but now here is where the miracle comes in. All right, you know what it's like around here, all right? There's not a soft spot in this town, all right? I landed on a drop zone, and I broke my hip and I broke my leg. And that's how I got involved is David and I were at a gym together. At the time, I was going through about my 3rd hip surgery. This thing has been with me my entire life. This happened when I was 22 years old. And I'm hobbling around on my crutches, and I tell David the story. And he's like, Rory, I got this thing going on, and you kind of add some color to it. So then he asked me to wear the uniform, and, feel a little goofy in it, but I can tell you that all these years later, it still fits. He didn't let me get to the punchline, provided I don't breathe. The rest of these guys, so Pirtle gets hit by this plane, all right? And it's, like I said, it's beyond understanding. I mean, the odds of this happening are just statistically impossible. The rest of these guys fall into what is now Park Meadows Golf Course, which at the time was a wetland. All those ponds you see, they cleaned up all the wetland and they turned them into ponds. That was the softest place within 50 miles of here, okay? It's incredible. They had one broken leg. One broken leg. Okay, all of these guys, they had never jumped before. One of the guys was literally hanging on to his parachute strings. He didn't even get the harness around him. And he went down the entire time just holding onto those. I want you to think about that, okay? Just think about, the feeling that this guy had. When I did it, I had 40 jumps. I was jumping with a bunch of professionals. We also jumped out into a storm, into zero visibility. I have never, that night is so vividly imprinted in my mind from the moment I jumped out of that plane until I didn't see the ground coming, big crack, flash of light, and Rory's military career was over. Okay, again, I couldn't have been better trained. I knew exactly what I was doing. These guys had no idea what they were doing. And yet all of them walked away from this, except for Pirtle, and of course Anderson, who died in the plane. So that's the color that they asked me to add.
Well, it's always hard to follow that, and follow Rory and what he's done. And we do recognize him in his service, always. Now, as Rory mentioned, Major Pirtle was struck by the plane, and it caught in his parachute and threw him up over the fuselage of the plane, probably killed him instantly. His body was found 9 hours later. The Army and a couple of high school kids from Park City High School followed the flight path of the plane and found his body down on, if you go to the Park City Cemetery and the little hill there to the north that's up there, that's where Major Pirtle's body was found. And one of those high school kids happened to be my uncle, Uncle Cliff. And never heard the story from him, never heard this story at all. And anyway, it was very, very, kind of heartbreaking that Anderson couldn't get a parachute on. Jack Anderson was kind of a big, tall guy, 6'3", and was moving about the plane, trying to help them with their oxygen and the heaters on the plane and never had time, or as Rory said, may have been, unconscious as part of the crash site there. His body was found with the plane on Iron Mountain. So the plane continued on around, made its circle then, circled over our head here, down over the cemetery, came across where Squatters is. That's why we put the plaque down at Squatters, because the plane came right directly overhead there. The plane actually hit the mountain twice. It hit the mountain about the 8,600 foot level and scattered parts there, and then bounded about a quarter of a mile over into the saddle of Iron Mountain there. It's now the home of multi-million-dollar homes, and the crash site's nestled right in there among those homes. It was a horrible site. It was broken into a million pieces. It was the worst crash site that the Army investigators had seen. There's a little picture of it at 8,600 feet, hits, and then crashes over into the saddle there. A couple of the eyewitnesses, Coffee John's was a little cafe just across the street from where Squatters is today, and then Park City policemen saw the plane come down the side of the valley there. Now, the other important thing about Christine, she got her revenge, but on that hike that we made in 2017, we hiked up. We had no idea where the plane had crashed. This was all, we were looking for it. But we stumbled on to Christine at that 8,600 foot level. And as far as I know, that's the only piece of the plane that was found where it first hit the mountain. As it crashed over into the saddle there were many pieces, and many people have hiked up there and got parts of that plane. But we found Christine that day buried under a pine tree, under some rubble. And I happened to kick the ground a little bit and saw this piece of metal. And I ended up, I thought it was a muffler off of a snowmobile or something. We did get it verified as being part of the plane. We call it the Iron Mountain Miracle, and the park record probably put it best. It might have been worse. All 6 of those men might have been wiped out, or the plane could have crashed here in Park City, as David mentions from time to time. So that's why we call it the Iron Mountain Miracle. Now, to get into the day's story, a week later there was an accident classification committee made up of 3 men from the 88th Reconnaissance Squadron, and Frank Bostrom, Harold Chafin, and David Rawls made kind of a superficial investigation. Pilots and planes were needed in those days, and they kind of came up with the idea that the causes of the accident were pilot error, the weather, and then the airspeed indicator were malfunctioning. And so those fellows made up the accident classification committee. A week after that, they are the pilots of 3 of those 12 bombers that are flying into Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. And so the accident classification committee is bringing these new B-17s into Hawaii. That's what they look like, these B-17E flying fortresses. Chafin was part of the rescue of General MacArthur when he was rescued from the Del Monte airfield on the island of Mindanao in the Philippines. And Bostrom was also part of the rescue. And this is where we ended up with our last lecture. We talked about the pilots that were the investigators of the crash of our B-18. were two pilots that flew General MacArthur out of the Philippines to safety in Australia. Give me a drink here. You can see that Bostrom served and had very great service after the war, also became a professor at Harvard University. He flew the plane, the actual plane that MacArthur and his wife and son were on when they flew him from Mindanao in the Philippines. As the Japanese are closing in on the Philippine Islands, they attacked the day, or just 10 hours after they attacked Pearl Harbor, they attacked the Philippine Islands. And so this is where someone in the audience, and I was hoping that person would be here tonight, asked me if I knew Elwood Offred, an Elwood Offred story. Was that you?
Yeah. Before you leave, give us your name.
Thank you. All right. Now, you can verify if my Elwood Offred story is correct. Elwood Offred was a Park City guy, and he was born in 1911 and lived here in Park City for several years. And this story begins on March 11th and 12th, 1942, and continues to 1943. General MacArthur, I have to give a little geography lesson here. The Philippine Islands, as you know, there are several islands there, and MacArthur's headquarters were there in on the island of Luzon in Manila. And as the Japanese began to take control of the Philippines, General MacArthur and his staff and family moved to the island of Corregidor. That was their first move, which sits at the end there of the Bataan Peninsula, if you've heard of the Bataan Death March. And so what we had to do, those pilots had to get General MacArthur from the Philippines, or Elwood Offred had to get, and his crew had to get MacArthur here from Corregidor down here to Mindanao, so the planes could pick him up, about 560 miles. And so this is where Elwood Offred's story kind of comes into play here. Now, I can't go into all the details of the thing, but there's a movie called They Were Expendable. It was a big blockbuster at the time, and there's a book called They Were Expendable. And I was able to get a hold of a copy of the book written in 1942 that tells the story of getting General MacArthur from Corregidor to the Dole Pineapple Plantation airfield there on Mindanao. It's quite a harrowing story. It's almost unbelievable what happened here. And this was one of the descriptions there. It was pitch black at night. It took 2 days to get there, and they were dodging Japanese ships and airplanes and what have you as they left Corregidor. The first day they got about halfway and hid among those islands, a small island there, and then the next day went on to the Dole airfield on Luzon. But some of the conditions they faced, it was pitch black. They had no charts. I could see absolutely nothing. The weather was terrible. There were big foaming waves, 15 or 20 feet high, thundering over the cockpit, drenching everybody topside. Our eyes were so continuously drenched with stinging salt that we couldn't see. And so it was a harrowing escape, trying to dodge the Japanese plus the weather. And Elwood Offred at the time was a chief machinist mate, and there were 4 PT boats that helped MacArthur escape from Corregidor. And Elwood Offred was on this motor torpedo boat number 35, and he was one of the in the group of 4 boats that helped with the escape. These boats were nothing but eggshells. This was the description in the book. They were designed to speed up to a Japanese ship and release their torpedoes and then run away. They were made of plywood, about 70 feet long and 20 feet wide, and they were powered by 3 very powerful Packard engines. And the boats did have some machine guns on board, but those were, minimal armament. And so the plywood on the deck was 3/8 of an inch thick. I mean, not even a half an inch thick. And so you can imagine how fragile these things were. Elwood Offred happened to be on PT Boat 35, I mentioned that. And as a chief machinist mate, he had a very important job. He'd actually been in the Navy for about 12 years, I think. He had joined like in 1930 when he left Park City. And anyway, each of these boats, these engines, gulp the gasoline. They hold about 2,000 gallons of gasoline. And usually the officers fueled the boats, and they had to strain the gasoline and pour it through funnels into the gas tanks there. And the gas itself was airplane grade fuel, 100 octane, described as being as ticklish as dynamite. Elwood Offred, one of his main jobs was taking care of those engines and helping to fuel those with the officers on board the boat. Now, as they were getting ready to leave Corregidor with General MacArthur and his family and staff, they noticed that the gas had been sabotaged. There was a lot of rust and dirt in there, and someone had melted paraffin wax, and it was mixed in with the fuel, and it clogged their filters. The filters had to be cleaned after almost each hour of the run. The boats had to stop and make this, or get the filters clean. So, as a chief machinist mate, Elwood Offred played a very important part of maintaining those engines and getting those boats ready for the escape. Usually there were about 12 men on board each boat, and these were the men that were on board Elwood Offred's boat. And after safely making the trip with General MacArthur to Mindanao, that boat was destroyed in April of 1942. And what happened to the crewmen then became, an interesting story itself. You can see that some were taken prisoner of war, some died while they were prisoners, some were evacuated. Elwood and several of his boatmates there continued to fight the Japanese on the island of Mindanao. They became guerrillas and engaged in guerrilla warfare there on Mindanao. Those were the fellows that were on his boat. There was one other fellow from Utah there at the bottom that was actually killed before the MacArthur made his escape. He was killed in action at Subic Bay. Now, interesting part of the story. For 17 months, Elwood Offred was missing in action. Family didn't know where he was or what had happened to him. The Japanese had closed in and taken over the Philippine Islands, and Elwood, we knew, had become a guerrilla fighter. And each month, or every so often, the newspaper would post the names of those that were killed in action or listed as missing. That was just a headline out of the Deseret News there. Finally, Elwood was rescued, I guess, or picked up after being missing from April of 1942 till September of 1943. He was finally recovered by the USS Bullfin on a secret mission, and as that submarine made this mission into that area of Mindanao, Elwood and 8 other men were taken on board and transported to Australia. And kind of an interesting sidelight to the USS Bullfin, if you've been to the Pearl Harbor Museum in Hawaii, at Pearl Harbor there's a submarine tour that you can take and go on board, and that's the USS Bullfin. And that was the ship that actually picked up and rescued Elwood and brought him back to Australia and then to the United States. After fighting with the guerrilla forces on Mindanao, he was evacuated on September 29th, 1943, and the Deseret News picked up the article that he was returning to Park City in on December 6, 1943, after he'd been listed and missing in action for 17 months. Elwood's mother died when he was very young, when he was like 10 years old, and his closest family was an aunt and uncle that lived here in Park City, and their home was right up across. If you go to the Park City Library, there's a parking lot just across the street there, and that's where the Offred home was. And Elwood then was returned to the family in December of 43 after being missing for 17 months. Now, General MacArthur was so pleased and so proud of these men and what they'd done and how they'd rescued him and got him to the airplane, that he awarded each of those men in that on those PT boats the Silver Star, and that's what I think the 3rd highest military honor you can get. And so Elwood is listed there for his gallantry, and kind of as a final idea, they were expendable. These men, you know, kind of held out as long as they could on the Philippines. But of the total, there were 6 torpedo boats, and all 6 of them ended up being destroyed or, destroyed in battle. But of the 82 men that made up that squadron, 9 are still missing in action, and 40 of them became prisoners of war. The Japanese, as they closed in on the Philippines, got 40 of them as prisoners of war, and 10 of them died while they were imprisoned. 6 made an escape to Australia. 4 of them returned to the United States, and they were the sources of the book. 9 of Elwood's companions there are still missing on the island of Mindanao, and then 12 of them, Elwood being among them, fought as guerrillas against the Japanese for at least that 17 months. So anyway, quite a story. Get a chance. You can get the movie, I think, on YouTube, or you can, I think you can still buy the DVD, the book. You can get the book. And quite a story, but a Park City guy linked to the airplanes that were flown to Mindanao to rescue General MacArthur, flown by pilots that investigated our accident and our accident in Iron Mountain. So this story kind of continues to grow on both ends. So thank you for being here. Appreciate it.
Questions, complaints? We got to get your name.
Tell us a little bit.
Pete Park.
That's good. I'll say one thing. Not only was the B-18 cheaped out, but the torpedoes that Steve is talking about were cheaped out as well. And for the first year and a half of World War II, whether the torpedoes were fired for submarines, PT boats, or dropped by airplanes, they were generally speaking defective and wouldn't work.
Pete, you've been up to the crash site with us, haven't you? Yep.
So it wasn't only the planes that were impacted. And again, why did we have to worry about a war? We're not going to go to war. So kind of a sad story, especially if you're on a PT boat, you shoot it and it doesn't work, you're screwed. Anyway, thank you all for being here. Say no. In fact, I've never seen you offer that. Tonight was one of your best friends. Yeah. Command performance.
That was terrific.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here.
Well, I think you're quite
Oh, no.
Thank you.